Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome back to the Ask Historians podcast. I'm user SteelCan909, once again coming up with you guys with a new podcast episode, this time with one of our flaired users. And I'm going to go ahead and let HaloFreak1171, or Anthony, go ahead and introduce himself and the topic that we're going to start with today.
Hey, thanks for having me today on the podcast. Long-time user, first time responder, I guess you would say. So I'm HaloFreak1171. Anthony, people on the subreddit may know me for answering a lot of the Australian history questions. That's kind of my area. I'm currently doing my PhD on the topic of Australian history, as well as I do run a Australian history podcast, a History of Australia podcast, if anybody who's listening is interested. Today, I think we'll be talking a lot about things I've done for my research so far. So both in terms of my honours last year and my PhD this year. So looking at the Rum Rebellion last year, and I was looking a lot at the people who were involved in that and trying to bring people back into the conversation there, because the Rum Rebellion's moved on to a more structuralist, materialist sort of analysis these days. And nowadays, with my PhD, I'm looking at the New Guard, so we'll talk about them as well. A fun little, in quotation marks, fascist group in 1930s New South Wales that not many Australians really know about.
All right, well, let's kind of start at the very beginning. As we mentioned before we started recording this, I imagine a lot of our largely American audiences' experience with Australian history is limited, to say the least. And of the things that we probably know, we probably heard Captain Cook voyages arrive there, and then convicts start showing up, and eventually you got Steve Irwin and Crocodile Dundee, right? That's a broad over American perspective on Australian history, which I'm going to assume there's a great deal more to delve into, not the least of which would be the presence of Aboriginal peoples, the colonization first by the Dutch, later the British, and kind of that whole process. So if you were going to kind of introduce Australian history to a unfamiliar audience, like I'm assuming many in our currently listening audience are, where would you start the conversation? Would you jump right into British colonization? Would you back it up a little bit? Kind of where do you see the story of Australian history starting at?
That's a really good question. I've not really thought about that from a standpoint. I mean, a lot of people would probably try to start from Indigenous Australian history, Aboriginal Australian history. I did that with my podcast. I did do the first 5-6 episodes were a broad overview of that history. But the way I always put it, and the way I felt most comfortable with talking about it, was I'm not a historian who specializes in that area. So for me to be telling those stories, trying to get something out of that, it's very likely I'm going to say something wrong or say something misinformed. And I don't want to be somebody who's contributing the misinformation. I can do as much research as I can, but in the end, it is an area where there are people who are far better researched, who understand it better. So I definitely start there, but with the caveat that there's always so much more to look into, I guess. And then we go straight into looking at things like Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and then the French and the British. So all that type of exploration, because I think that's something that's key to understand, is it wasn't just the British came here and colonized. It was an ongoing connection from Australia with the outside world. And in that, you can also talk about how Indigenous Australians up north met with the Makassar, some Indonesian people, and traded with them from the 1500s, 1600s onwards. And it kind of shows this ongoing level of interconnection that a lot of people assume Australia doesn't have. People kind of assume it was very isolated, but it did have a lot of connections up north. And that's kind of where I'd start. And then, ease straight into that British history, because in the end, unfortunately, or fortunately, however you look at it, that is the bulk of colonial history, be it once you get past 1788.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, when we're looking at the early colonization of Australia, again, the outsider's perspective, you've got a whole bunch of convict ships coming up. And the way that I've often heard it described is it's not a dissimilar kind of connection to what you might see in the United States with connections to the Mayflower and the other early settlement patterns in the Americas, similar to what you might see happening in Australia. Excuse me. Excuse me. So, can you speak to a little bit in that terms of connection, where there's kind of this ongoing association with these early groups of people coming in and creating that colonial identity?
Yep, yep. So obviously, yep, the convicts do come in. You have the First Fleet, Second Fleet, Third Fleet, and then it kind of becomes a trickle, especially as we converge from convict towards more free colonization. These free colonists coming in. Um, these days, yeah, Australians do connect in a similar way to, I guess, things like the Pilgrims or your first colonists in America. There is a connection there. It's often looking towards this idea of the convict being a bushman, somebody who's self-sufficient, a larrikin, so somebody who's funny in the face of danger, all that sort of stuff. The convicts kind of are meant to embody that national spirit. But if we go back even like 60, 70 years ago, that wasn't the case. Most Australians were actually really embarrassed by our convict past. They really did not want Australia to be seen as a convict nation. So a lot was done to distance Australia from the convict past. It's only since Federation and even more recently past World War II where you start to see Australian historians and Australian public as a whole re-embrace that convict past. So it's a really interesting disconnect over time, and it kind of speaks to how Australians want to view ourselves. Nowadays we want to view ourselves with them because we want to view ourselves as bushmen, larrikins, all that. But back in the day, Australians wanted to view themselves as a elegant, sophisticated society, something that was similar to Europe, and the convicts didn't play into that role. So if you're reading stuff from the 30s, 20s, 10s, even before that, it's a lot of degradation of convict life. It's a lot of pushing away from that and then uplifting people like John MacArthur, the free colonists who came here, because they are what set up real Australia in a lot of people's eyes.
Interesting. When we're looking at the sorts of convicts and so on, and even the early free settlers of Australia, can you tell us a little bit about the groups of people that are coming over? Are we talking about largely nonviolent convicts? Are we talking about particular ethnic groups from the British Isles? Where's the kind of ongoing connections to both convict past and British identity, however you want to parse that out?
Yep. So a lot of the convicts were mostly non-violent. There were some violent offenders. Oftentimes, those were the ones that would end up at a place of secondary punishment, which was often Norfolk Island or later on Van Diemen's Land. So people who'd do a second crime, once they were here, they'd be moved to another colony because that was considered their secondary punishment. But for the most part, they were non-violent. They tended to be from the working class, lower class areas of Britain. A lot were from London, but a lot were also from throughout the rest of England as well. There were a couple Welsh, I think a few Scottish as well, but mostly English. You do get a few mixed ethnic people, like a few mixed ethnic groups there. I know at least one African convict who comes across. His name, I don't think his proper name is ever remembered, but it's Black Caesar. That is something that is remembered in the history books. He's got a really interesting history on his own, but for the most part, it is white, English, lower class people who are coming across. The other people who come across, soldiers, they tend to be of a bit higher class variety. They're people who, they might be down on their luck, but they're looking to gain something from coming in, whether it's money, experience, a promotion. That was a very often one. They're looking to get higher up. And then the officers or free colonists tend to be very high up. So Bligh himself is a well-known aristocrat at this point. John MacArthur, who becomes a free colonist after being a soldier, becomes a well-known aristocrat as well. These guys are from the upper crust of society.
Well, you mentioned Bligh, and we can kind of go ahead into that topic. Many of our viewers, or listeners, I should say, are probably at least familiar with the story of the mutiny on the HMS Bounty, even if they don't know all of the ins and outs, even if they haven't seen the movie with Anthony Hopkins and Mel Gibson. They've at least heard of the mutiny on the Bounty, I would assume. So can you walk us through how Willliam Bligh goes from being mutinied after his crew mutinies, puts him and the others in the boat and sets them adrift, and how do we get from that to him becoming a governor of New South Wales in very early or relatively early in Australian colonial history?
Yep. So Bligh, obviously, yep, he gets mutinied. He ends up back in Britain, and there is a lot of investigation into how this happened and why this happened. And it ultimately comes down that some see Bligh as culpable, a lot don't see Bligh as culpable. They think it's the mutineers who were at fault for the whole incident there. So Bligh's image isn't really blemished in the eyes of the Colonial Office or the Navy. He's kind of still seen as a competent officer. Then I think we fast forward a couple of years. I'm trying to remember the exact date of the mutiny on the Bounty, but in any case, we fast forward a bit. And Australia as a colony is kind of in a weird place. So before Bligh, there are three governors. There's Phillip, who tends to get a pretty good light shown on him. And then there's Hunter and King, who both have pretty negative light shown on them. And between them, there's some interim governors, lieutenant governors, Grouse and Patterson.
Before we move on, can we clarify, when we're talking about Australian geography, where are we talking about, like, the early colonial centers in Australia?
Yep, so at this point, it's really just Sydney and its boundaries there. There's not much more than that. There's some talk at this point. There's been trials to go to Van Diemen's Land. There are some small colonies in Van Diemen's Land and one in Norfolk Island, but for the most part, the colonial centre is Sydney and its outlying areas. So all the way up to about the Hawkesbury region, which is a river which runs along the edge of like modern day Sydney currently.
And for clarification, Van Diemen's Land is Tasmania, right?
Yeah, I should definitely. Yeah, the Van Diemen's Land is Tasmania. I'll be referencing as Van Diemen's Land just because at this time that is the name. It is used.
I get it, and that's again for my clarification. Again, Crocodile Hunter, Crocodile Dundee. That's about my cultural awareness of Australian history. So we have these. So again, Sydney being the center of all this, and how long does it take for the other parts of Australia to start getting cities set up? Like, obviously, much of Australia is still not inhabited. But how do you get from there to cities like Perth, Canberra, Darwin? And I'm sure that's a very long story, but just kind of how do we get from these early settlements with these kind of competing governors to cities all across at least the coastal regions?
So it does take a bit of time. Sydney is obviously colonized in 1788. We start getting colonization of Van Diemen's Land around the early 1800s. Hobart, I think it's around 1804, but don't quote me on that exact date. And then after that, it takes another 20, 30 years for it to spread around the rest of the country. We do see some stuff in, like, nearby to Sydney, so Newcastle, all that starts getting colonized. But then in the 1820s, you get Melbourne first colonized. There was an abortive attempt earlier on that completely failed. And then 31, I believe, or around that time is Perth, and then 36 is Adelaide. And so by that point, you have five of the major capitals that are now exist are now colonized or settled. Brisbane's a bit later than that. You're getting into about the 1840s there. Darwin is a weird story. There's a bunch of military outposts there throughout the colonial period, but it itself doesn't become a proper like city, town, what have you, until like the latter half of the 1800s. And then Canberra's all the way down the end. That's a created city we make in the 1920s. So that doesn't even exist. That doesn't even exist until after Federation. But yeah, so
I did not know that.
Yeah, for a long time, Australia, well, the colonies was just really Sydney. And there was other stuff happening, but Sydney was the colony.
And so William Bligh ends up as governor of New South Wales, or just Sydney, or
yeah, New South Wales. So at that point, everything is New South Wales still.
Okay, and then that also raises another question: is there a Northern Wales, a new North Wales?
I have no clue. I think it was called New South Wales because it was a New Wales and also a south of the actual Wales, and so I think they just gave it both of those, which is an odd way to do it. You think it would just be New Wales or South Wales, but maybe there is another Wales around there that was already a New Wales.
So, sorry, I know we digressed from that kind of setup for the William Bligh situation a little bit. Let's dive into that. So, Rum Rebellion, William Bligh, he gets to have Mutiny 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Yeah, so he ends up there because, like I said, Hunter and King have a pretty downgraded, like, in terms of reputation. During that time, so what happens, Philip runs the colony in a pretty pragmatic way. And since most people respect him, there's not really much issue. There is some, and there's a lot that can be talked about there. But in the end, to simplify, it's going fine. He leaves, and then for a year and a half, we're left with a lieutenant governor, Grouse. And Grouse believes Philip was doing colonization wrong. He thinks all the land should go to the military. Now, he doesn't give all the land to the military. That's a gross oversimplification. But he gives a lot of it to them. And he kind of breaks down this wall. Originally, land was just meant to go to mostly convicts who had run out their sentence. So once they did their 14 years, they'd be given a plot of land. So that way, they wouldn't come back to Britain, but they'd also make the colony more productive. Grouse is like, no, we need to give it mostly to the military who are here. The military officers, the military soldiers. And that breaks down this barrier. And that once that barrier is broken down, there's no plug to stop it. Hunter and King both try to, but they're stuck with the fact that this military now has a monopoly on land, and soon enough a monopoly on products as well in the colony. So they try their best to delay that, to stop that, but they both fail really hard, in part due to John MacArthur. Now, MacArthur at the time of Philip is pretty much nobody, but Grouse elevates him really high. We're not sure why he did that, we just know he did. And from that point, MacArthur essentially takes the attitude of, I'm not going to take any BS from anybody above me in authority. He's well known for having dueled the captain of the boat he came to Australia on with, just because I think he didn't like where he and his wife was placed. He ends up, Patterson, who's another lieutenant governor at one point, is the commanding officer of MacArthur. They get into a duel at one point, and normally at this time in duels, you're meant to miss. You're meant to shoot, but not to kill. MacArthur would see that as a failing on his part. So he shoots to kill, and he destroys Patterson's shoulder for a while with the shot he has. And this is his direct commanding officer. So he gets sent back to England because of that. But MacArthur essentially is this force who keeps getting governors taken away from Australia. He'll go to the office and say, Hunter's this horrible governor. He does things wrong. You need to replace him. And he'll get the voices of other colonists to come in and say that, and then Hunter will be removed. And then King will come in, and it's okay for a bit. And then King and MacArthur have a fallout, and then MacArthur gets King removed. Again, a simplification, but that's kind of what's happening. So when Bligh gets here, he gets to a colony that's in the throes of almost a military aristocracy. And he's specifically told by the office, you need to rein in the military, you need to rein in the rum, even though we know nowadays that's not as big of an action issue. It's more of a symptom, not a cause. You need to rein in the rum trade, and you need to get the colony back to this penal colonialism we were trying to do. This current type of state is not what we want. And because Bligh is seen as an authoritative man who can get things done, but also because of the mutiny on the Bounty, it's believed he is the best man for the job. So his mutiny actually plays in his favor of getting this job as governor. And so he arrives in New South Wales in 1806, prepared to do what needs to be done. And for like 2 minutes, him and MacArthur are good. There's like a small little letter chain where they're like, MacArthur's like, I'll support you as long as you advance our interests. And Bligh's like, I'm going to do what it takes. And they're at this really uneasy scenario. But then really quickly, the two men fall out. And so from there, honestly, there's a lot going on. So there's a lot of property rights issues. MacArthur brings this up a lot. Property is seen at the time as an extension of a man's rights. So if you take property away from a man, you're taking his rights away from him. And in 1800s Britain, the Empire, that is seen as a big no-no. A man's rights is a big thing. That's kind of what's going on. You can't take rights away from a man. And so that's going on. And the materialists and structuralists argue that's a big part of it. This whole change in scope and thinking of what a person's rights in plays to that. But at the same time, it's also MacArthur and Bligh are bloody stubborn. They both are very, very stubborn to the point of, from 1806, they're playing this game of chicken, where they believe the other one will bend to what they want, because everything else has in the past. They both used aggressive and even violent means to get what they want, and it's worked for them. So they don't see why it can't work here. But you see the issue, right? You've got two people who believe aggressive, violent means work in every case, and they're both coming to face each other. you end up on this crash course where MacArthur just really does not want to listen to Bligh. He really does not care for Bligh's authority, and Bligh believes that is the biggest slight you could have in a colony like this. MacArthur, he isn't a part of the military at the time, but he was at one point. And Bligh believes MacArthur needs to listen to his authority. And to be fair to Bligh, that is kind of how the colony is set up. The governor did have ultimate authority over the area. And so we kind of spiral going into 1807 and then into 1808 especially. I can keep talking about that whole thing and how that kind of we end up at the Rum Rebellion.
Yeah, well, so you mentioned that rum is kind of a symbol of what's going on here. So can you walk us through a little bit? When I imagine most people think of Australia, they don't think of a rum-producing area. So kind of what's going on there with the rum trade? Why is it seen as a particular problem that needs to be stamped out? And how does it get to this symbolic status for this rebellion?
Yep, so obviously the name Rum Rebellion is the big name. So back in the day, one of the few things that Australia could produce besides its agricultural stuff was rum. It was fairly easy to produce. It only required a still, which most pretty decent off people could get. But the issue was that the convicts weren't meant to have any more alcohol, but the wealthy officers or even the soldiers could produce this rum. And so rum, in lieu of other in terms of money, became a bargaining item, a really good bargaining item. It wasn't a lot of sources, secondary literature that isn't like academic will talk about it being the only currency in Australia. That it wasn't true. It was a barter economy. Rum played just one part of that bartering economy at the time, but it was a big part nonetheless. So what was happening was these people were trading with rum. Convicts were getting drunk when they shouldn't be. Rum was getting in ways that it also shouldn't be getting in. Ships were being traded with that people weren't meant to trade with. And so every governor was told, stop letting rum both get into the colony or be made in the colony. You need to stop both. And every time they tried, the soldiers and officers would go, well, no, you can't do this. We need this for living here. It's a good bargaining tool. And they'd get upset at the governors. And so we reach this point where rum gets to a status because people believe the New South Wales Corps, which is the volunteer army at the time, is working mainly on rum. This isn't true. They do have ways of getting money and all that. They're getting stuff for their work. But this belief comes that rum is a big part in how they move about. And it is in a way, but it's not that massive. And so rum becomes this symbol of like, this is why people are rebelling. It's because they're not allowed their rum. That's not entirely the case. And these days, most academics will view rum as quite tertiary to the whole event, no matter what view they're taking. There was a really interesting article written, I think, a few years back about somebody saying we need to bring rum back into the conversation, who thought that perhaps we have stemmed too far away from that topic. But I think that's still a revision, a conversation that still needs to be had for a while, whether rum has been too removed. But these days, rum is pretty tertiary to the whole thing, even though the name remains Rum Rebellion. My honest thesis title, the short title, was actually Rum Rebellion or MacArthur's Coup, because I believe there's worth talking about changing how we talk about this topic in terms of its name.
Well, that gets into kind of the next element of it. So you have these tensions between two somewhat stubborn, irascible figures, and throw alcohol on top of it. It's always a great idea. And so what happens next? What happens to Bligh?
Yep. So we get
MacArthur?
So we get into the late part of 1807, and things aren't going well because Bligh isn't just upsetting MacArthur. There are a bunch of other influential colonists at this point that are called the exclusives, and they really don't like what Bligh's doing. Bligh is trying to turn back the tide of the colony. He's not just getting angry at one colonist. He's saying, we need to change how property is done. We need to change how this economy is done. We need to do things in a penal colonial manner. And these colonists, who've essentially had free reign to expand their territory for the last 10 years, are really unhappy about that. So throughout 1807, you get multiple letters back to the colonial office from different colonists saying, Bligh's doing this, Bligh's doing that. I don't like it. You need to reprimand him. You need to stop him from doing that. And that's normal. That's the normal channel. You see that in every governor's period. Colonists get mad. They'll write back to the colonial office. The colonial office will write to the governor. The governor will write back to them, essentially criticizing the colonists. And it goes back and forth, back and forth. That's life. But when we get to 1807, what we start to see is MacArthur is really annoyed at a bunch of things. He's annoyed at the fact that his property is being delayed in a bunch of places, or his title is being changed and shifted. And he starts talking to the other colonists, and he's essentially saying, well, why are we listening to this man who is effectively an outsider? He's a naval officer. He's not a military officer. We're all military men, not naval men, which is a big issue at this time because obviously competing branches of the British Empire's military. But also, why are we listening to him when he's got idiots in his government? Richard Atkins, the judge advocate at the time, so the main lawyer, the main legal representative, has no real legal experience. He's a known gambler and drunk back in the day. And people really don't like him as well, but he's representative of Bligh's legal authority in the colony as well. So there's just these confluence of factors that keep building up and building up. And we're getting to the point where MacArthur and Bligh are sending each other barbs back and forth about, you need to do this. And one will go, no, I'm not going to do this. Why would I listen to you? Such and such. And so in November, December 1807, we kind of reach a boiling point here where things have gotten so bad that the big incident that happens is a ship that MacArthur has part ownership of comes into port. And it has a bunch of stuff on board that Bligh doesn't want to come in. So he goes, oh, no. It takes a convict on board, accidentally. On purpose. I don't forget which it is. And Bligh says, well, this ship can't leave now. Because we think it's trying to stow away convicts. It has in the past stowed away convicts. We think it's trying to do it again. MacArthur, you need to pay for this ship's passage for it to even have a chance to leave. And MacArthur goes, no, I'm not doing that. In fact, I'm selling away all rights to the ship in total. So these guys on the ship now have no owner. They're just stuck on board a ship in this random colony at the end of the world. So at some point, they march onto land and say, MacArthur told us to come to land and things will get sorted out. And Bligh goes, no. You have to stay on board the ship. It's illegal what you've done. And it's illegal what MacArthur's told you to do. And they go, well, it's not our fault. And Bligh goes, no, I'm going to go talk to MacArthur. He needs to come and talk to me. So Bligh sends out one of his magistrates to go get MacArthur and bring him to Government House. Magistrate gets there, knocks on the door and says, MacArthur, you have to come. If you don't, you'll get in trouble. And MacArthur, essentially, depending on the sources you believe, says something along the lines of, next time you come, I will shoot you, and I'll hang everybody, including Bligh myself. Now, I don't know if that's actually what it said. This is what Bligh says MacArthur said, but it's very likely he had said something very incendiary towards the governor. The magistrate leaves. Bligh's like, well, that's not acceptable. He gets a warrant put for MacArthur's arrest alongside a bunch of armed men. They go to MacArthur's house and arrest him. MacArthur accepts being arrested this time because everyone in the colony is kind of like, that's not okay. Even his allies are kind of like, don't fight it. Because at this point, he's kind of overstepped the line. And so MacArthur, kind of seeing that he's overplayed his hand, accepts being arrested. But he doesn't stop fighting. The moment he gets arrested, he sues Richard Atkins for a debt Atkins owed him like 20 years ago. Or even 10, 20 years ago. And Atkins is like, okay, whatever, I'll pay you back the debt. Plus interest. And MacArthur's like, well, no, that's not what I want. I want to show that you're not a worthy judge to judge me in this upcoming case. And so they go back and forth. And then Bligh does a mistake. He starts delaying MacArthur's property titles. MacArthur's trying to get a few new properties. And MacArthur keeps going, no, Bligh keeps going, you can't have this one. You can't have this one. You can't have this one. And MacArthur's like, well, can I have this one then? And he goes, no, you can't have this one. Very obviously just spiting MacArthur. But then he stumbles into the trap of MacArthur goes to his friends, his other influential colonists, goes, look, Bligh is using this to take away my property. He's going to do the same to you. And they go, oh, we don't want that. And so Bligh's made a huge mistake here. He's alienated the people who could keep MacArthur in line. They haven't done so before. But if he was going to have any chance of keeping MacArthur in line, he needed these other influential colonists and the military to not back MacArthur. But in this crucial moment, by messing with MacArthur's property rights, he's given cause to these other colonists to step forward, these military men to step forward and start thinking of, well, maybe Bligh isn't best for us. And so things happen. January comes, and we get to the trial of MacArthur. The day starts, and MacArthur just immediately launches into a tirade, lambasting Atkins as a horrible judge, a horrible person, as somebody who's not worthy of judging him in this court. And Atkins is like, okay, I'm not going to take this right now. I don't need to take this. I've got better things to do. So he gets up and he leaves, saying, this court can't continue if I'm not here, since I am the legal representative of the crown in this colony. MacArthur is like, whatever. And the 6 officers, so every court case involving a non-convict at this time involves 6 officers of the military, naval, and government branches. These guys are like, oh no, we'll just continue the court and try to keep MacArthur's trial going, but they want to do it because they are on MacArthur's side. They can just do a court case and get MacArthur free. Atkins goes up to Bligh and says, I've left the court case. They're continuing it, and they still have my papers, which is theft of government property. I need it back. And Bligh writes to the court, because they're all just in the courthouse now. Bligh writes to him and goes, can you stop doing what you're doing, and 2, can you, give the papers back? And they go, no. No, we're not doing that. So Bligh manages to get MacArthur arrested again. They put him in jail. The court is still convened. And so you've got these 2 camps now. MacArthur's in jail. Bligh is sitting in his government office with Atkins and others going, what are we going to do? And these military officials and influential colonists are all together as well. And this entire time, there's one big piece happening in the background. George Johnston, who's the acting lieutenant governor, so the acting head of the military, has been in his far-off colonial home because he injured himself while riding a horseback from a party the other night. So the whole time, he's not there to help Bligh. Bligh writes to him going, hey, you need to come down and help me fix the situation. And Johnston goes, no, can't do that, I'm too injured. But then the very next day, so night occurs, Johnston gets up and goes, nope, I'm coming down there. But he doesn't come down there on Bligh's side. He's been convinced by the colonists to join them, to do something about Bligh. Now, Bligh doesn't know any of this. He doesn't have any contacts in the colony at this point. Anybody who's with him is at his house. But the colonists and the military get together, they go to the courthouse and they break out MacArthur, saying, your arrest was illegal, you shouldn't be here. And they start writing a petition that essentially says, Bligh is no longer governor, MacArthur's not arrested, all this stuff. On the signature that Johnston writes, he uses the title Lieutenant Governor. By using that title, he is saying that he is now the governor of the colony. So beforehand, he was just a lieutenant. He adds governor to his title to say that he's usurping Bligh's authority in the colony. And so a few more things happen, and they march on Government House. A bunch of the New South Wales Corps marches, a bunch of the exclusives, these influential colonists march. They get there. There's no guards. The guards that would normally guard Bligh's house are all part of the Corps, so they just leave. The only thing that's stopping them from getting in is a locked gate and Bligh's daughter, who apparently hits a bunch of them with an umbrella at one point, which confuses a bunch of the men because they're like, what do we do about this woman who's hitting us? Because we're not meant to hit this person. She's an aristocratic woman. We can't hit her. They eventually move it aside. They get in the house. A bunch of people are in there and we have no clue where Bligh is. And they're and the Corps he has to be in this house. So for about a couple hours, they're doing this game of hide and seek in Government House, trying to find Bligh. And as the story goes, apparently they find him hiding under his bed. Now, I don't think that's I don't think that's accurate. I think that's kind of something said later on to make Bligh look a lot worse. He was hiding in any case. From Bligh's own testimony, we know that he wanted to escape and go to the Hawkesbury, where he did actually have a lot of support amongst the less influential colonists. So the farmers up there, a lot of the emancipists, these ex-convicts, supported Bligh. He wanted to ride up there and, what he says, form an army, a militia, to fight against the New South Wales Corps. So by his standpoint, he believed he was about to start a civil war. But in any case, he gets arrested. They put him in chains and go, you're now not governor. The governor is Johnston, with MacArthur being his second man. And so from this point, Australia, New South Wales, is now a military, junta. It is a military-led, dictatorship. And that's just happened. Nobody's asked the Colonial Office if this is okay. Nobody's talked to anybody. This has just happened. And so the first things first is, everyone in the colony is well, who do we tell about this? We've overthrown the governor with no legal right, really, to do it. We've done it because we believe our rights were being disturbed, but, who do we tell? Who can we tell? Who's going to be okay with this? They tell the people in Van Diemen's Land. There are 2 lieutenant governors there in 2 little colonies. There's Patterson, who, as you'll remember, MacArthur shot at one point, and who is the commanding officer of the actual whole army. At this time, Johnston was just an acting one. And there's David Collins, who was the old judge advocate, who's in a different colony. And they go, hey, we kind of overthrown Bligh. What do we do? And Collins is I'm not doing anything. This doesn't involve me. Patterson's I would come and help, but I'm sick. And so for 6 months, nothing happens. It's just Bligh and MacArthur, Johnston and MacArthur, leading this colony. And quickly it devolves. Influential colonists want different pieces. Their different wants and needs clash with each other. But it's just this chaotic mess of land being given out, things being changed because the colonists and the army want different things. 6 months later, this guy called Faval comes back to Australia. He'd previously been on Norfolk Island. As he's coming there, Patterson writes to him and goes, hey, you're going to New South Wales, right? And Faval goes, yep. So you have to deal with the fact that Bligh has been overthrown. And Faval goes, I'm not dealing with that. And Patterson goes, yes, you are. I'm sick, so I can't deal with that. And Faval goes, oh, I don't want to deal with that. And Patterson goes, well, you have to. Sorry. XOXO, I'm not dealing with it. So Faval gets to New South Wales colony and goes, y'all need to stop. I'm now acting governor. Y'all are not anything. I'm going to deal with you, Johnston and MacArthur. Bligh comes up to him and goes, okay, you're here now. Could you, reinstate my authority? Faval, who doesn't like him, goes, no, you're going to stay under house arrest. He's been in house arrest under 6 months, and the moment another person comes in, they also go, nah, I think you're sticking around as a house arrest person for now. And so Faval kind of does his thing for a while, and then Patterson finally comes up. He's actually sick at this point, so he was kind of lying beforehand, but now he's sick. He gets to New South Wales and takes over Faval and goes, okay, I'm fine. I've talked to the Colonial Office. We're going to settle this. Bligh, you need to head back to Britain. Johnston and MacArthur, you're also heading back to Britain. MacArthur, you're going on trial. Johnston, you're going on court-martial for this. So first he sends Bligh back to Britain. But he makes a mistake. Bligh gets on the Porpoise, which is a naval vessel. And if you'll remember, Bligh is the only person here who is a naval official, not an army official. So the moment he steps on this boat, he turns to them and goes, I'm actually the only authority you have to listen to because I'm a naval officer. You need to take me to Van Diemen's Land where Collins is. I'm going to go there and get Collins to help me reassert my authority in New South Wales. He sails to Van Diemen's Land down to Hobart and asks Collins, hey, can you help me? Collins goes, no. You can stay here. I'm not going to help you. And so Bligh ends up in house arrest on a boat for a year. Fast forward, a new governor finally comes, Thomas Macquarie, comes around. He gets to New South Wales. He sends Johnston and MacArthur finally for court-martial. Bligh comes up to New South Wales upon hearing the news. Macquarie goes, okay, you're governor now. You're not governor anymore, just to make a continuity. So he reinstates Bligh, then takes over to make a legal continuity. You're going back to Britain as well to deal with this court issue. And then after 2 years, we finally get proper authority settled back into Australia. But for 2 years in New South Wales, we were under this kind of coup-led government in various stages. And no one really talks about it, the fact that this is a real thing that happened in Australia's history. And it's a mess because they're all not idiots, but they're all kind of like these egotistical, arrogant men who think they know what's best, and they continually mess up what to do at this moment.
Wow, that's a lot right there.
Yeah.
You mentioned in there's kind of this distinction in the historiography of the event where you've got the materialist, structuralists, and then kind of this personality interpretation. Can you walk us through a little bit of the materialist structuralists? You've mentioned them a little bit previously, like you talk about the issues of land distribution, barter economy,
Yeah.
versus the personalities. Can you kind of walk us through where some of the debates that are going on are actually happening in here?
Yep. So obviously, the New South Wales colony at the time is being set up at a real interesting time in British history. So there's a lot of movement towards this idea about including more rights for people, more representative government throughout the British Empire, not just in Britain. But the colony is obviously ostensibly made as a penal colony. There's not meant to be any rights here. It is just convicts and soldiers. And then there'll be some free colonists later on, but nobody really thinks about that question. So when the free colonists do come, whether it be convicts who are given land after serving a sentence, or people who come as soldiers who finish their term, or just come on their own accord, there's no representation they can make. They don't get a government. They don't even get advisory councils at this point. They have to listen to what the governor says. And so the structuralist materialists kind of say that at this point, what you're seeing is people who know they have rights. They know rights exist in the British Empire. It is a inherent part of being British that you're getting these rights, coming to this colony and not getting these rights. And so structurally, they don't believe that the colony is set up in the right way. In a lot of these letters, they say, if you gave us some type of voice, we wouldn't be as mad, essentially. If there was some way to represent ourselves, we'd be better off. And so that's one area of it. And the other one is just you kind of seeing this transition in New South Wales. This transition from a penal colony towards a free proto-capitalist colony. And so the Rum Rebellion kind of sits as that transitionary point, where you see penal colonialism try to be reasserted and fail, and proto-capitalism, even though MacArthur and Johnston are sent away, be fully asserted, because after Macquarie comes in, there are a lot more measures put in for giving land to free colonists and gradually increasing representation and all that. So it's kind of this idea that you see these big shifts in the British Empire being played on a small scale in the New South Wales colony. This shift from a penal colony which can't sustain itself as free colonists come in, because it's just not built for that type of thing. Where I came in with my honest thesis was, I believe at some point we kind of discarded the personal too much, because there are these two people, Bligh and MacArthur and other colonists, who without them you probably don't get such a violent and aggressive moment. As I was saying earlier on, the way most colonists dealt with this was just by writing to the colonial office. They'd write, the governor would write, and they kind of have this back and forth. And that was the standard way of doing it. It's how most colonists had gone about it. It's only MacArthur who's willing to take things to an extreme. We see that in his previous life, shooting his commanding officer, taking on other governors. And it's only Bligh, who's already faced mutiny and essentially said to the mutineers, throw me over the boat or kill me. I don't care what you do. I am the authority. If you're going to overthrow me, do it. Who's willing to take this head on. And so it's only when you get these two individuals who are really determined to be right and have their view as the right one, where you get a moment where a rebellion can happen in New South Wales.
What is the perception in Australia ever since then of these figures? Like, what happens to Bligh and MacArthur and all of them? I assume their courts martial and other legal issues eventually do play out. How does it all get wrapped up?
Yep, so Johnston gets censured. He doesn't lose his position, but he does get censured, so that's a bit of a mark on his career. Bligh is honestly quite fine. He ends up becoming an Admiral of the Blue, which is one of the highest symbolic titles you can have in the Navy at that point. And MacArthur, he is technically exiled from the New South Wales colony for 7 years. He's just kind of not allowed back. At that time, his wife, Elizabeth, plays a massive role in keeping his investments there secure. But he comes back and becomes a leading figure in like the small but growing Australian democracy, the advisory councils, and then the ongoing representative stuff that comes. He still plays a major role in that regard. These days, it's kind of back and forth. MacArthur is seen by a lot of people, especially those who see things like capital. But people who are more capitalistic, they see MacArthur as the hero of the story, fighting against an authoritarian government to get rights, to get freedoms. Whereas, weirdly enough, people who are more communist, people who are more socialist, Dr. Evatt is a big one. He's an old leader of the Labour Party here, are pro-Bligh. They see Bligh as fighting against this capitalistic movement and working for this smaller man. Which is weird when you think about Bligh being a representative of the monarchy, but at the time he was actually fighting a lot for smaller farmers, smaller individuals at that time. So it is kind of why you see these people on the left tend to uplift Bligh more compared to MacArthur. So it's a weird dichotomy along political lines you see in their legacies. For my view, I kind of just see them both as kind of insane individuals. I don't think either man is really a good person. I think they were both ultimately guided by selfish wants, the need for authority and power and legacy. And that's kind of why they ended up in the situation they did. They weren't willing to compromise because they were very much led by their egos.
We're going to go ahead and stop our discussion right here. We are going to have a part 2 of this conversation, which will come out a little bit later on, looking at some other further developments in Australian history. We'll be talking about the process of confederation, the creation of an Australia as a distinct cultural, political unit, and some of the more radical political movements that rise in Australia, such as the New Guard, once we get into the interwar years. But for right now, we're going to go ahead and stop this discussion. I'm going to go ahead and let Anthony sign off and give you guys any information that he wants to plug, and we'll see you guys the next time around.
Too easy. Thank you so much. It was great being here for this part 1. I'm excited for the part 2, especially since it's what I'm currently researching. Yep, I've been Anthony. You'll find me on the subreddit as HaloFreak1171. You find me on Blue Sky as Anthony, Anthony Zugris. I'm very easy to find on there. I post a lot. And yeah, if you're interested, if this has been interesting to you at all, check out the A History of Australia podcast on pretty much every platform. I talk a lot more in depth about the Rum Rebellion and Australian history as a whole. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/AskHistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.